Welcome to World Social Studies for Elementary Teachers. This is lecture C6, System Development. This lecture looks at globalization. It is the last lecture in the section on system development. In this lecture, we'll look at the phenomenon of globalization and what led to it and try to explain and understand more about it. So you should be able to accomplish the objectives listed on this slide after listening to it. A year ago, I read an interesting story about this family in Utah, and they had read an article about microcredit and how people in developing countries struggled to find basic resources for their needs. And they thought, we'd sure like to help out a family in the developing world. So what they did was they used their connections through church and social connections to identify artisans from around the world. They primarily used the internet, though, to ask for people if they knew people. And from their home in Utah, they were able to connect with various people from all over the world and encouraged them to make creches, which are handcrafted nativity scenes. These artisans made these handcrafted nativity scenes and then shipped them to the family in Utah, and the family in Utah then used the internet to market these items and sell them to buyers from around the world. In this way, global artisans, craftsmen in remote parts of the world, were able to reach out and find a market that did not exist prior to the contact that this Utah family made. This is an illustration of one of the possibilities that an interconnected, globalized world has, is crafts and individuals who might not have otherwise been able to spend their life making their crafts now can. They can make a living keeping their traditions and their craftsmanship alive. Now we can contrast that positive outcome of globalization with the more negative story of farmers in Mexico who have found it impossible to make money off of planting their traditional crop of corn. This is because in a globalized market, their corn must compete head-to-head with American corn. Americans grow corn using industrial means and produce large quantities of it with very few workers, and they're able to sell it very cheaply abroad. In contrast, many of the small farmers in Mexico are still using traditional practices in their farming, which means they're not competitive. They can't sell their corn as cheaply as the Americans. This means that the market dries up for these Mexican corn growers, and they're no longer able to make a living doing what their fathers and grandfathers had done. As a result, entire cultures are threatened with collapse in rural Mexico. So with globalization, we have the good and the bad. This lecture finishes our discussion of system development with a look at globalization as an important concept to understand for how the current system operates. And we need to realize that the world today, and I'm recording this in spring of 2012, the world looks very different than it did in the 1980s, 30 years ago. The computers that I've pictured here are just an illustration of how things have changed. The K-Pro computer on the left is actually, to date myself here, that's what I learned how to use a computer on. And that's a far cry from the machine that I'm using to record these lectures. Hairstyles have changed, music have changed. The world's a very different place. And globalization is one of the main reasons that the world looks very different now than it did back in the early 1980s. Now, the definition of globalization shows on the slide here focuses on relationships and interconnectivity, and it includes things like culture and people. While the term globalization refers to all interactions, it's important to realize that economic trade is the main driving force for these increased interactions. And the interaction, interdependence, and interconnectedness of the modern world is largely a result of globalization. This diagram shows the relationships the United States has with its trading partners. The green and blue show countries that have a surplus with the United States, meaning more money is flowing into the United States. And the countries that are red show a trade deficit, where the United States is spending more money out to those countries. But it's an interesting diagram to show the volume and scope of trade just with the United States. Now, why did all this happen in the intervening 30 years, from the early 1980 to the current early 2010s? The declining cost of transportation is one of the key factors. We can mark the beginning of globalization with the decline in the cost of transportation in the mid to early 1980s, particularly by the late 1980s for sure. It may seem like gas is expensive now, and if we look at this chart, we see that actually in the last couple of years, the price of gas has indeed spiked. But if we look at in real terms from the price of gas that we pay now, then what we realize is that gas is cheap compared to our parents or our grandparents. This chart begins in 1987, but if it were to continue prior to this period, this is the period of globalization here. Prior to this, the red line would go up into the 70, 80, even $100 a barrel range once you adjust for inflation. That is because your parents and grandparents had quite expensive gas. But during this period where globalization really took off, in the late 1980s throughout the 1990s, gas was very, very cheap on a historical basis. And this fueled globalization. Improvements in the technology of transportation has cut costs as well. We've developed ways to ship huge quantities of goods at once, which decreases the per unit cost of that shipment. So the container vessels now carry many more containers than they used to back in the 1960s and 1970s. In fact, these container ships are so massive that they no longer fit in the Panama Canal. They have to go through around Africa or around Latin America because they can't go through the canal. The Panamanians are in the process of trying to fix that by widening their canal. But the point is that the sheer quantities of shipping has had a fundamental shift, and it's due to the technology gains, both in the size of vessels that can be done, also the computer loading and unloading facilities, which enables a factory to make a good in China and to have a semi-truck full of goods packed in China, loaded onto a ship, sent across the ocean, unloaded from that ship, put directly on a semi-truck, who then drives to a store in Montana and opens up the container, and everything that store ordered is in there. There's no need to send it to a central processing facility where everything is sorted out and sent to where it needs to go. The technological capabilities of the global shipping industry is just incredible. So So what this means is that you can ship goods for just pennies a pound. This has made it so that labor is now the greatest cost of a good, because you can pick up a raw material in one place, ship that raw material someplace else to where it can be processed, and then once it's in a good you can sell, ship it again to a different place where its primary market is. Back when transportation was more expensive, that was cost prohibitive, and so you needed to manufacture a good close by where the raw materials were, or you manufactured a good close by where the markets were, so you shipped your raw materials to the markets. That's no longer the case, and so now you can do the labor-intensive part of turning the raw materials into the manufactured good wherever on the planet labor is cheapest. And so that has resulted in a shift of manufacturing from the developed countries where manufacturing was first generated to the developing world where labor is quite cheap. It's not just the transportation of goods that is cheap. The cost of moving people is lower as well. With discount airlines and deregulation and again the general low price of fuel compared to historic trends, global travel is now possible. And global travel used to be something only the elite did because only they could afford it. Now there is a middle class that can travel globally, and they can come from any parts of the world to any part of the world. And this changed the face of the tourist industry, for example. So we have the flow of goods and the flow of materials. We also have increased flows of people as well. So in addition to the declining cost of transportation, another factor that has fueled globalization is an increase in the speed and accuracy of information exchange. This has enabled transparent interactions where financial transactions or engineering transactions can happen real time and in a transparent way, so you can track a process from one step to another. Essentially, the internet and the ability for instantaneous communication has changed the face of business. If we think back to pre-globalization in the early 1980s, if you were an Intel technician or engineer, and in working in your cubicle in Tempe, you came up with a clever new innovative chip design. You then had to take your plans, get on an airplane, fly to Malaysia, and have meetings with your counterparts in Malaysia to discuss changing the way the fabrication plant was situated so that you could maximize your chip design. And weeks or months would go by before those changes would take effect, as the design teams would fly back and forth between Tempe and Malaysia. Well, now with the internet, you could send an email which immediately arrives to your counterparts in Malaysia. The plans can be put in a Google Docs so that you have you can control versions, and you can work simultaneously in a collaborative way with people from around the world. You can use Skype technology in order to have conference calls, so that the need to actually get on a plane and go to Malaysia has almost disappeared. And you can move your chip design change from months before it takes effect into days, if not hours, before it can take effect. So the pace of innovation, the pace of information flows, and the ability to manage a global enterprise has just dramatically increased in the last 30 years. The last 30 years have also seen an increase in capital fluidity. And what that means, capital is a fancy word for money. It means that it's much easier to send money from one place to another place. Going back to the 1960s or 1970s, if you wanted to build a new facility in Malaysia, you might have had to take hard currency on your plane as you went over there, exposing added costs, added security risks, and just general pain in the neck to deal with currency exchange. Well, now the speed and volume of financial exchanges have dramatically increased. Information networks have transformed money from being pieces of metal or paper that you carried around to mere digits on a screen. And with a stroke of a keyboard, you can transfer vast sums from one part of the world to another part of the world. And so capital is constantly scouring the world to look for maximized returns and to shift, to adjust, to meet the capital needs of different parts of the world. Now combine that speed and ease of use of money with the development of a regional currency in Europe with the euro, and the growing economic integration of the Europeans, the North Americans, the Asians, and generally the globe with the World Trade Organization and IMF. And we have a financial infrastructure that enables business and industry to take place on a global scale. Now, the dollar is still the reserve currency. It is still the currency that everyone turns to when they're feeling threatened. But global capital flows have made a global market for money. An example of this would be the financial crisis in 2008, where American banks ran into trouble with their account balances once the reality of their unsustainable loans to homeowners occurred to them. And very quickly, that financial gridlock that occurred when nobody really knew what their bank shares were worth quickly jumped to the Asian markets and the European markets. Brazil had difficulty with the real. Russia had difficulty with their currency, all because some bankers in New York decided that they had made a poor investment in real estate. So the global economy is interdependent and integrated with each other now because of globalization. Another factor that has encouraged globalization is a decrease in tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. And we'll discuss this in more detail later in the unit on international trade. But for now, you just need to know that at the end of World War II, the global average tariff, the price that was tacked onto a good if it crossed countries' borders, was 66%. So if you had something that sold for $1, once you paid the tariff on it, you had to sell it for $1.66 just to break even. Well, that was at the end of World War II. By 1992, that global average tariff was down to 6%. So from 66 to 6%. And that global average tariff has continued to decline in the intervening 20 years since 1992. So the barriers to trade have been reduced, and that pattern of reducing barriers is the overall pattern that explains globalization. These forces of technology and finance and decreased barriers all combine to reduce the cost and thereby increase the volume of trade so that production and consumption now occur on global scales. I love this picture as a snapshot of what globalization means. Here we have a ship with an Antigua Barbuda flag. That means that's who they pay their taxes to. And they're unloading wind turbines that were made in Brazil at a port in Olympia, Washington, so that Washington can build their wind generating power station. So that's a good illustration of, just in the Western Hemisphere, of economic integration and interaction. It's also important to note that not just trade barriers have dropped. Remember, prior to the late 1980s, there used to be whole parts of the planet that a Westerner could not go safely. The end of the Cold War meant a free flow of people, and with them, ideas. Interdependence has also led to a rise in English being the common language. Partly that's because the Americans won the Cold War, and part of it is because the United States is the dominant power, and the British were the dominant power before that. And so English has now become the global language of business. And that common language has enabled cultures and peoples to interact with each other where prior to this they may not have been able to. So more people are communicating with the world. The advantage of all of this are a few, and they're not insignificant. The first advantage is it's decreased the cost of goods overall. Because businesses have been able to take advantage of economies of scale, because the cost of transactions have gone so low, things are cheaper. And they're not just cheaper for Americans, they're cheaper for everyone around the world, because goods are now sold on a global marketplace. So a good that can be sold for $1.50 in Arkansas can't be sold for $4 in Algeria, because the seller of that good will simply go sell them for $1.75 and make a huge profit in Algeria. So costs have fallen, which has enabled which has increased the standard of living for poor people and middle class people around the world, and that's an unambiguously good thing. The second advantage is increasing the access to goods. People are able to consume goods that they never would have been able to in the past. If we go back to the story at the very beginning, the artisans from around the world, they're able to make those things because they can now make a living selling those things to a global marketplace. And homes in America can have a nativity scene made by someone who hand sewed it in Mongolia. Well, 30 years ago that didn't happen. So there's a breadth of goods that is available to people that was not the case before. I remember growing up, the first time I saw a kiwi fruit. It was a brand new thing, and everyone was made a big deal out of this bizarre green fruit that no one had ever seen before. Well, now kiwi is like no big deal at all, but it's an example of how trade and interaction has increased in my own lifetime anyways. A third point, which is less unambiguous, this third point is arguable, and that is it has increased interaction has led to greater tolerance. And the argument is that as cultures interact with each other, that they can develop an awareness and an appreciation of the nuances of those cultures, that foreign cultures are less strange than they might have otherwise been. I can go home and listen to world music, for example, on my computer, and listen to bands singing languages and music styles that I would have never been exposed to prior to this. And it brings an appreciation for these foreign cultures. Now, I say that's not uncontroversial because there are some who argue that interaction between cultures leads to as much friction as it does understanding and tolerance. And there's something to be said for that. But the argument, though, is that globalization can be a positive thing because of that increased awareness and understanding of foreign societies. There are some disadvantages to globalization as well. One of the primary complaints given by people who are frustrated with globalization and its impact is that it harms local producers. And what's meant by that is that in a globalized marketplace where labor can be shifted to wherever it's cheapest, then local communities lose the ability to sustain themselves in some ways. A community that specialized in making bicycles, for example, in, say, Illinois, and had for generations, suddenly has to compete with bicycles made in Korea and Malaysia. And those Asian bicycles are made cheaper than the ones in Iowa. And so they lose out in the marketplace, and that manufacturing base disappears. And so local producers are harmed. The example that I gave at the beginning of the Mexican farm growers is a classic example of local producers that are harmed by this global marketplace. The other complaint of globalization is that it threatens local culture. And the argument is that Western goods tend to be cheap and tend to flood the market, particularly because the United States is such a huge market. We buy so many things that manufacturers around the world tailor their goods to the American preferences because that's the primary market. That means that smaller markets around the world end up buying things that were designed for Americans, and they lose the uniqueness of their own culture as a sort of sameness pervades the world, because the economy of scale of production leads to marketing to buy general goods. And so you end up with the term is called the McWorld, that the whole world has McDonald's now, and there's a blandness that crushes the vibrancy of local cultures. So that may be putting it too strong, but that's one of the main criticisms that is given against globalization, is that it is a threat to local culture. So, good, bad, or both, globalization has had a tremendous impact on the global system, the pattern of interactions that exists between states and the peoples in those states. Now, this concludes our discussion of system development, and we can go back to the first lecture in C1 and ask, how did we get here? Why does the world look like what it looks like today? And what I've hoped we've done through this series of lectures in Unit C here is outline the trajectory that the world took to better explain why the world looks like what it looks like today. And by understanding that, you can better understand the dynamics of the interactions that we see in the world today.